Hello, my name is Jan McFarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. Welcome to those of you who are here in the room with us tonight and to the 400 or so people who are joining online. We offer an especially warm welcome to those of you who are new to the Free Speech Union and who've come tonight on the invitation of our partner for this event, Sense About Science. If you're not familiar and you're not somebody who's come via that route, then Sense About Science is an independent charity that stands up for the public interest in sound science and evidence. It's been providing clear and balanced evidence on difficult and often misunderstood areas of science for over 20 years, defending the space for people to ask difficult scientific questions and to discuss uncomfortable evidence for the public good. And I've been really delighted to work with David Schley and Tracy Brown over the past few months, the Deputy Director and Director of Sense About Science. So tonight is the first in our series of 3 events framed within the theme Science, Skepticism and Free Speech. Over the course of March, April and May, we aim to explore the importance of critical thinking, open inquiry, and the freedom to question, in particular how those tenets have been fundamental to the development of the scientific method and the expansion of scientific knowledge. I'll tell you about the other 2 events in the series at the end of tonight's proceedings, but tonight's lecture is titled, What is Science and Why Should We Care? And will be given by a very special guest, Professor Alan Sokal, Professor of Mathematics at University College London and Professor Emeritus of Physics at New York University. In addition to numerous academic papers, Alan is co-author with John Bremont of the book Intellectual Impostures, Postmodernist Philosophers' Abuse of Science, and the author of Beyond the Hoax, Science, Philosophy and Culture, a reflection on Alan's submission of an academic paper, for those of you that don't know the back history here, the paper entitled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which he submitted successfully to the journal Social Text in 1996, an act which intended to test, expose and parody the weakening intellectual integrity, as Alan saw it, that was threatening academia at the time. I'm sure we can, if he doesn't cover it in his lecture, we can discuss with him where he thinks we're at now. As a result of the hoo-ha that the publication of that paper caused, and it was a hoo-ha, international headline coverage, Alan's surname tends to go before him, and if you type, as I did, Sokal hoax into Google Scholar, you'll pull up over 5,000 results. And if you type Sokal affair, you will find over 13,000 references to him. So it appears he is rivaled only by Judith Butler in the notorious academic stakes. But you'll be very relieved to hear that Alan is rather more eloquent and better at making himself understood, at least so we hope. So tonight he's going to draw out the unique contribution of the scientific method to human progress and to address contemporary trends which threaten to undermine it. So the format will be, Alan will give us a lecture of roughly up to an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, both with the room and also people at home can write their questions in the Q&A. So write them in the Q&A box rather than the chat, and my colleague Vinay will read plenty of those out afterwards. So do formulate your questions for Alan as he's speaking, ideally questions, but we'll have space as well for longer comments later on. So can we please give a very warm welcome to Professor Alan Sokal.
So thanks, Jan. And so I'd like to thank Tracy, David, Jan, and everybody at Sense About Science and the Free Speech Union for inviting me to give this talk, which will be about the nature of scientific inquiry and how it's related to the freedom of debate. So my overarching goal tonight will be to stress the importance not so much of science, but what I'll call the scientific worldview, or as some people might prefer to say, the evidence-based worldview in humanity's collective decision-making. So this is a concept that goes far beyond the specific disciplines that we usually think of as science, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. What I want to argue is that clear thinking, combined with a respect for evidence, especially inconvenient and unwanted evidence, evidence that challenges our preconceptions, those are of the utmost importance to the survival of the human race in the 21st century. Now, of course, you might think that calling for clear thinking and a respect for evidence is a bit like advocating motherhood and apple pie, if you'll pardon me this Americanism. And in a sense, you'd be right. Hardly anyone would openly defend muddled thinking or disrespect for evidence. What people do, rather, is to surround these practices with a fog of verbiage designed to conceal from their listeners, and in most cases, I would think from themselves too, the true implications of their reasoning. So George Orwell got it right when he observed that the main advantage of speaking and writing clearly is that when you make a stupid remark, its stupidity will be obvious, even to yourself. So I hope that I'll be as clear tonight as Orwell would have wished, and I intend to illustrate disrespect for evidence with a variety of examples coming from the left and the right and the center, starting from some fairly lightweight targets and proceeding to heavier ones. I aim to show that the implications of taking seriously an evidence-based worldview are rather more radical than many people realize. So let me start, maybe a bit pedantically, by drawing some important distinctions, because the word science, as it's commonly used, has at least 4 distinct meanings that I think we need to keep separate. On the one hand, it denotes an intellectual endeavor aimed at a rational understanding of the natural and social world. It also denotes a corpus of currently accepted substantive knowledge in each of these fields. It denotes the community of scientists with its mores and its social and economic structure. And finally, it denotes applied science and technology. So in this talk, I'll be concentrating on the first 2 aspects, with some references also to the sociology of the scientific community, and I won't address technology at all. So by science, I mean, first of all, a worldview giving primacy to reason and observation, and a methodology aimed at acquiring accurate knowledge of the natural and social world. This methodology is characterized above all else by the critical spirit, namely, the commitment to the incessant testing of assertions through observations and/or experiments. The more stringent the tests, the better. And to revising or discarding those theories that fail the test. One corollary of the critical spirit is fallibilism, namely the understanding that all of our empirical knowledge is tentative, incomplete, and open to revision in the light of new evidence or cogent new arguments. Though, of course, the most well-established aspects of scientific knowledge are unlikely to be discarded entirely. Now, it's important to note that well-tested theories in the mature sciences are supported in general by a powerful web of interlocking evidence coming from a variety of sources. Hardly ever does everything rest on just one crucial experiment. Moreover, the progress of science tends to link these theories into a unified framework, so that, for instance, biology has to be compatible with chemistry and chemistry with physics. The philosopher Susan Hack has illuminatingly analogized science to the problem of completing a crossword puzzle, in which any modification of one word will entail changes in interlocking words. In most cases, the required changes will be fairly local, but in some cases, it may be necessary to rework large parts of the puzzle. I stress that my use of the term science is not limited to the natural sciences, but it includes investigations aimed at acquiring accurate knowledge of factual matters relating to any aspect of the world by using rational empirical methods analogous to those employed in the natural sciences. So science, as I use the term anyway, is routinely practiced not only by physicists, chemists, and biologists, but also by historians, detectives, plumbers, and indeed all human beings in some aspects of our daily lives. Of course, the fact that we all practice science from time to time does not mean that we all practice it equally well, or that we practice it equally well in all areas of our lives. Now, the extraordinary successes of the natural sciences over the last 400 years in learning about the world, from quarks to quasars and everything in between, are well known to every modern citizen. Science is a fallible, yet enormously successful method for obtaining objective, albeit approximate and incomplete, knowledge. Now, surprisingly, not everyone accepts this, and I'll come back to those people in a moment. But before that, I'd like to discuss a first set of adversaries of the scientific worldview, namely the advocates of pseudoscience. People who don't denigrate science and indeed claim to venerate it, but want to pass off a counterfeit version of it. Now, this is an enormous area, so I'd like to focus on one socially important aspect of it, namely so-called complementary and alternative therapies in health and medicine. Now, not all of these therapies, I stress, are necessarily pseudoscience. That has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. But some are, and I'd like to look at one of the most widely used alternative therapies, namely homeopathy, because its advocates sometimes claim that there is evidence from meta-analyses of clinical trials that homeopathy works. Now, one basic principle in all of science is GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And this principle is particularly important in statistical meta-analysis, because if you have a bunch of methodologically poor studies, each with small sample size, and then subject them to meta-analysis, what can happen is that the systematic biases in each study, if they mostly point in the same direction, can reach statistical significance when the studies are pooled. And this possibility is particularly relevant here because meta-analyses of homeopathy invariably find an inverse correlation between the methodological quality of the study and the observed effectiveness of homeopathy. That is to say, the sloppiest studies find the strongest evidence in favor of homeopathy. And when one restricts attention only to methodologically sound studies, those that include adequate randomization and double blinding, predefined outcome measures, and clear accounting for dropouts, then the meta-analyses find no statistically significant effect, whether positive or negative, of homeopathy compared to placebo. But the lack of convincing statistical evidence for the efficacy of homeopathy is not, in fact, the main reason why I and other scientists are skeptical, to put it mildly, about homeopathy. And it's worth taking a few moments to explain this main reason. Most people, perhaps even most users of homeopathic remedies, don't clearly understand what homeopathy is. They probably think of it as a species of herbal medicine. Now, of course, plants contain a wide variety of substances, some of which can be biologically active, with either beneficial or harmful consequences, as Socrates learned. But homeopathic remedies, by contrast, are pure water and starch. The alleged active ingredient is so highly diluted that in most cases, not a single molecule remains in the final product. And so the fundamental reason for rejecting homeopathy is that there is no plausible mechanism by which homeopathy could possibly work unless one rejects everything that we've learned over the last 200 years about physics and chemistry, namely that matter is made of atoms and that the properties of matter, including its chemical and biological effects, depend on its atomic structure. There's simply no way that an absent ingredient could have a therapeutic effect. High-quality clinical trials find no difference between homeopathy and placebo because homeopathic remedies are placebos. So let's at least say one thing in favor of homeopathic remedies. They may be useless, but at least they're harmless. Unlike conventional or herbal medicines, there's no danger of an overdose. Now, advocates of homeopathy sometimes respond to this argument by asserting that the curative effect of homeopathic remedies arises from a memory of the vanished active ingredient that is somehow retained by the water in which it was dissolved, and then by the starch after the water is evaporated. Don't know how that happens. But the difficulty, once again, is not simply the lack of any reliable experimental evidence for such a memory of water. Rather, the problem is that the existence of such a phenomenon would contradict well-tested science, in this case, the statistical mechanics of fluids. The molecules of any liquid are constantly being bumped by other molecules, what physicists call thermal fluctuations, so that they quickly lose any memory of their past configuration. And when I say quickly, I'm talking picoseconds, not months. In short, all the millions of experiments confirming modern physics and chemistry also constitute powerful evidence against homeopathy. So for this reason, the flaw in the justification of homeopathy is not merely the lack of statistical evidence showing the efficacy of homeopathic remedies over placebo at the 95% or 99% confidence level. Even in an experiment at the 99.99% confidence level wouldn't begin to compete with all the evidence in favor of modern physics and chemistry. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And in the unlikely event that such convincing evidence is ever forthcoming, the person who provides it will assuredly win a triple Nobel Prize in physics, chemistry, and biology, beating out Marie Curie, who only won 2. So let me now pass to another set of adversaries of the scientific worldview, namely academic postmodernists and extreme social constructivists. These people insist that so-called scientific knowledge does not, in fact, constitute objective knowledge of a reality external to ourselves, but is a mere social construction on a par with myths and religions, which therefore have an equal claim to validity. Now, if such a view seems so implausible that you wonder whether I'm somehow exaggerating, consider the following assertions from prominent sociologists. Quote, "The validity of theoretical propositions in the sciences is in no way affected by factual evidence." Kenneth Gergen. "The natural world has a small or non-existent role in the construction of scientific knowledge." Harry Collins. "For the relativist, such as ourselves, there is no sense attached to the idea that some standards or beliefs are really rational, as distinct from merely locally accepted as such." Barry Barnes and David Bloor. "Since the settlement of a controversy is the cause of nature's representation, not the consequence, we can never use the outcome, nature, to explain how and why a controversy has been settled." Bruno Latour. And finally, "Science legitimates itself by linking its discoveries with power, a connection which determines, not merely influences, what counts as reliable knowledge." Stanley Aronowitz. Now, statements as clear-cut as these are actually rare in the academic social constructivist literature. More often one finds assertions that are ambiguous, but nevertheless can be interpreted, and quite often are interpreted, as implying what these quotations make explicit, that science as I have defined it is an illusion, and that the purported objective knowledge provided by science is largely or entirely a social construction. One classic example of this was sociologist Andrew Pickering's book, Constructing Quarks, which was ominously published in 1984. I won't hold that against him. That book provided a superb and extraordinarily detailed history of modern elementary particle physics, sandwiched between initial and final chapters of, well, let me be blunt about my view, astonishingly poor philosophy. On the basis of that philosophy, Pickering concluded that, quote, "There is no obligation upon anyone framing a view of the world to take account of what 20th century science has to say. Worldviews are cultural products. There's no need to be intimidated by them." Dare I say that this is grossly misguided? Of course, our ideas about quarks are a human, historical, and social construction. That's a truism. But there is good reason to believe that the quarks themselves have existed ever since the Big Bang, roughly 13.7 billion years ago. But the reasons justifying that belief are subtle. Quarks are not, after all, directly observable. Neither, of course, are dinosaurs. All we can observe are their fossils. But dinosaurs are, or rather were, mid-sized macroscopic objects, and we can easily imagine what they looked and behaved like by analogy with contemporary animals that we are able to observe today. So we certainly have good reason to believe that there existed, at some time in the past, roughly 240 to 65 million years ago, the animals that we call dinosaurs. Subatomic particles like quarks, by contrast, are very far from our everyday experience, and their behavior is extraordinarily strange. Quantum mechanics was invented by Schrödinger and Heisenberg in 1925, so next year will be the centenary. But no one today, I think, really understands what quantum mechanics is telling us about the fundamental nature of the universe. Let me put this in the first person. I've been studying quantum mechanics for slightly over half that century, and the more I learn about it, the less I understand. And yet, quantum electrodynamics can predict the magnetic moment of the electron to 11 decimal places accuracy. That's equivalent to measuring the distance from Los Angeles to New York to within the width of a human hair, as Nobel laureate Richard Feynman memorably put it. Quarks are in fact even more subtle than electrons. Electrons are too small to be directly seen, but we can at least observe their tracks in bubble chambers. But our best contemporary theories tell us that free quarks cannot exist. They're always bound within other elementary particles, such as protons and neutrons. Their existence and behavior must be inferred by a complicated chain of reasoning involving both experiment and theory. The general outlines of that reasoning can be explained to the lay reader, but it's indubitably subtle. Okay, fast forward 4 decades. Now the entire American medical establishment, from the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics to the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association, and even the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, insists that sex, as in male or female, is, in the AAP's words, an assignment that is made at birth. Now, what on earth could this possibly mean? The facts about sex are straightforward and are taught in any half-decent high school course in biology. Nearly all animals, as well as many plants, reproduce sexually. In all sexually reproducing species, this occurs by combining a large gamete, called an ovum or egg, with a small gamete, called a sperm. Though some so-called hermaphrodite plants and animals produce both ova and sperm, there are no hermaphrodite mammalian species. In mammals, each individual produces only one kind of gamete. Those individuals that produce ova are called female. Those that produce sperm are called male. Whether a mammal embryo develops into a male or a female is determined by a pair of sex chromosomes, XX for females, XY for males. In short, sex in all animals is defined by gamete size. Sex in all mammals is determined by sex chromosomes, and there are 2 and only 2 sexes, male and female. For sure, quirks of mutation or prenatal development may leave some individuals unable to produce viable gametes at all. But an infertile individual with a Y chromosome is still male, just as a one-legged person remains a full member of our bipedal species. Now, much is speciously made of the fact that a very few humans are born with chromosomal patterns other than XX and XY. The most common is Klinefelter syndrome, XXY. It occurs in about 0.1% of live births. These individuals are anatomically male, though often infertile. Some extremely rare conditions, such as de la Chapelle syndrome, which is 0.003%, and Swyer syndrome, 0.0005%, arguably fall outside the standard male-female classification. But even so, the sexual divide is an exceedingly clear binary as any distinction you can find in biology. So where does this leave the medical association's claims about sex assigned at birth? Well, a baby's name is assigned at birth, no one doubts that. But a baby's sex is not assigned, it's determined at conception, and is then observed at birth, first by examination of the external genital organs, and then, in cases of doubt, by chromosomal analysis. Of course, any observation can be erroneous, and in rare cases, the sex reported on the birth certificate is inaccurate and needs to be subsequently corrected. But the fallibility of observation does not change the fact that what's being observed, a person's sex, is an objective biological reality, just like their blood group or their fingerprint pattern, not something that's assigned. The medical association's pronouncements are social constructivism gone amok, but this time about a subject that's been more or less accurately understood by humans, albeit without all the scientific details, ever since the beginning of our species. Sex, unlike quarks, is not subtle. What could possibly have impelled sober-minded scientists to advocate such a bizarre and easily refutable view? The cause is evidently political. The medical establishment's newfound reluctance to speak honestly about biological reality, and I'd add its insouciance in speaking dishonestly about it, presumably stems from a laudable desire to defend the human rights of transgender people. But while the goal is praiseworthy, the chosen method is misguided. Protecting transgender people from discrimination and harassment does not require pretending that sex is merely assigned. The bottom line is this: it's never justified to distort the facts in the service of a social or political cause, no matter how just. If the cause is truly just, then it can be defended in full acceptance of the facts about the real world. If that cannot be done, then the cause is not just. And when an organization that proclaims itself scientific distorts the scientific facts in the service of a social cause, it undermines not only its own credibility, but that of science generally. How can the public be expected to trust the medical establishment's declarations on other controversial issues, such as vaccines, issues on which the medical consensus is indeed right, when it has so visibly and blatantly misstated the facts about something so simple as sex? So the adversaries of scientific thinking are no longer just outsiders, such as homeopaths or social constructivist sociologists. Today, the adversaries of scientific thinking can be found within the citadel of science, and that's deeply worrisome. Even more worrisome is that these ideologues are not only advocating deeply misguided ideas and misrepresenting well-established scientific knowledge to do so, they're also trying to suppress counterarguments. For instance, UCL neuroscientist Sally Baxendale has recounted the difficulties she had in publishing her review of the impact of puberty blockers on neuropsychological function. Other researchers who are skeptical of the gender-affirmative orthodoxy in medicine have similar stories. And so here I'd like to explain the importance of the freedom of debate as a foundation for scientific knowledge. As John Stuart Mill observed long ago in his famous essay On Liberty, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Now, the first side of this bifurcation is clear. Of course, we all naturally think that our current opinions are correct, but we still ought to be willing to admit that we're not infallible. And that means, if you really care about truth, that you ought to be open to hearing arguments against your current opinions, and open to changing those opinions whenever the counter-arguments turn out to be cogent. The other side of Mill's bifurcation is less obvious, so let me quote Mill again. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons of the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. That is not the way to do justice to the arguments or bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest and do their very utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. 99 in 100 of what are called educated men are in this condition, even of those who can argue fluently for their opinions. Their conclusion may be true, but it might be false for anything they know. They have never thrown themselves into the mental position of those who think differently from them and considered what such persons may have to say. And consequently, they do not, in any proper sense of the word, know the doctrine which they themselves profess. So Mill's two-pronged argument in favor of the freedom of debate is in fact a crucial ingredient in legitimizing knowledge in general and scientific knowledge in particular. And it's striking that Mill himself used an example from science, namely Newtonian mechanics, to explain why. Isaac Newton published his celebrated Laws of Motion in 1687. And by the time that Mill was writing in 1859, scientists had accumulated overwhelming evidence from both terrestrial and astronomical observations that Newtonian physics was correct. I should say, even to the point of predicting accurately in 1846 the existence and precise location of the as yet unknown planet Neptune. But Mill points out, if at some point the government, or even the scientific societies, had decided that, in view of the overwhelming evidence of the correctness of Newtonian mechanics, it would henceforth be forbidden to dispute it, then we would now have much less reason to believe in the correctness of Newtonian mechanics. It's precisely the fact that Newtonian mechanics has held up in the face of free and open debate that gives us justified confidence in its correctness. That was Mill's very important observation, but there's an added twist to the story, which also illustrates the first side of Mill's argument, though unfortunately Mill didn't live to see it. It turns out that Newtonian mechanics is not exactly correct. This was discovered in 1905 by Albert Einstein, more than 30 years after Mill's death. But this important fact might never have been discovered, or at least its discovery would have been delayed, if criticism of Newton's theory had been forbidden. Okay, let me now make a few observations about the connection between science and public policy. Many decisions that we need to make collectively about anything from educational methods to pandemics to climate change need to be based on scientific knowledge. We need to have detailed factual evidence about how children learn, how viruses spread, and how the Earth's oceans and atmosphere behave. But although this scientific information forms the essential background for public policy, it doesn't determine that policy, since policy decisions also involve values and trade-offs between competing values. The French Association for Scientific Information, AFIS, which is one of the international partners of Sense About Science, put it very well in its manifesto. They said, "We think that science cannot by itself solve humanity's problems, but that solving humanity's problems cannot be done without using the results of science. We call for a clear separation between scientific expertise, what science says, and decision-making, what society chooses to do. Decision-making, which includes value judgments, is a matter of democratic choices. It is outside the scope of the association." Now, concerning the first stage of this process, establishing the scientific facts, scientists rightly have a privileged voice when speaking within their domain of scientific expertise. And I would stress only then, only when speaking within our own domain of scientific expertise. Privileged because the experts do know things that lay people and politicians don't. But not exempt from external critique because no one's views should be exempt from reasoned critique. Furthermore, this social privilege rests on the soundness of the scientist's claim to be pursuing and finding objective evidence-based knowledge. Scientists forfeit that privilege whenever there's good reason to believe that ideology rather than evidence is driving the alleged scientific results, as it was, for example, with Lysenkoist biology in the Soviet Union in the 1930s and 1940s, and as it is today, I believe, albeit without the gulags, in the medical establishment's claims about the treatment of teenage gender dysphoria. The second stage of this process is where things get stickier. Scientists whose work has strong public policy implications may understandably feel very strongly about those policy decisions. For example, climate scientists know far better than most of us about the potential dangers of global warming. And they are understandably worried and even exasperated by the weak and dithering responses of most governments. And yet, they need to be very careful and to follow Afis's advice in distinguishing clearly which hat they're wearing at any given time. When giving information about scientific facts, they have a privileged voice. When expressing their opinions about public policy decisions, they have the same voice as any other citizen, no more, no less. If they fail to make that distinction, the public may react by discounting their views, even when they are giving factual information within their domain of expertise. And that would be a great shame. Okay, so now we've traveled a long way from science, if you understand it narrowly as physics, chemistry, biology, and the like. But the whole point is that any such narrow definition of science is misguided. We live in a single real world. The administrative divisions used for convenience in our universities don't, in fact, correspond to any natural philosophical boundaries. You can't use one set of standards of evidence in physics, chemistry, and biology, and then suddenly relax your standards when it comes to medicine or public policy. Or rather, you can do so, and all too many people do, but you have no justification for doing so. Now, lest this sound to you like a scientist's imperialism, I want to stress that it's exactly the contrary. As the philosopher Susan Hack lucidly observes, quote, "Our standards of what constitutes good, honest, thorough inquiry and what constitutes good, strong, supportive evidence are not internal to science. In judging where science has succeeded and where it has failed, in what areas and in what times it has done better and in what worse, we're appealing to the standards by which we judge the solidity of empirical beliefs or the rigor and thoroughness of empirical inquiry generally." So the bottom line is that science is not merely a bag of clever tricks that turn out to be useful in investigating some arcane questions about the inanimate and biological worlds. Rather, the sciences are nothing more or less than one particular application, albeit an unusually successful one, of a more general rationalist worldview centered on the modest insistence that empirical claims must be substantiated by empirical evidence. Conversely, the philosophical lessons learned from 4 centuries of work in the natural sciences can be of real value, I think, if properly understood, in other domains of human life. Of course, I'm not suggesting that historians or policymakers should use exactly the same methods as physicists. That would be absurd. But neither do biologists use precisely the same methods as physicists. Nor, for that matter, do biochemists use the same methods as ecologists, or solid-state physicists as elementary particle physicists. The detailed methods of inquiry must, of course, be adapted to the subject matter at hand. But what remains unchanged in all areas of life is the underlying philosophy, namely, to constrain our theories as strongly as possible by empirical evidence, and to modify or reject those theories that fail to conform to the evidence. That's what I mean by the scientific worldview. It's because of this general philosophical lesson, I think, far more than any specific discoveries, that the natural sciences have had such a profound effect on human culture since the time of Galileo and Francis Bacon. The affirmative side of science, consisting of its well-verified claims about the physical and biological world, may be what first springs to mind when people think about science. But it's the critical and skeptical side of science that's the most profound and the most intellectually subversive. The scientific worldview inevitably comes into conflict with all non-scientific modes of thought that make purportedly factual claims about the world. And how could it be otherwise? After all, scientists are constantly subjecting their colleagues' theories to severe conceptual and empirical scrutiny. On what grounds could one reject phlogistic chemistry, or the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or Newton's particle theory of light, just to take a few discarded but not ridiculous scientific theories, and yet accept homeopathy, astrology, or the idea that sex is assigned at birth? Now, the critical thrust of science even extends beyond the factual realm to ethics and politics. Now, of course, philosophically, that's a mistake. As a logical matter, one cannot derive an ought from an is. But historically, starting in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, and then spreading gradually to more or less the entire world, scientific skepticism has played the role of an intellectual acid, slowly dissolving the irrational beliefs that legitimated the established social order and its supposed authorities, be they the priesthood, the monarchy, the aristocracy, or allegedly superior races and social classes. 400 years later, it seems sadly evident, as I've tried to demonstrate tonight, that this revolutionary transition from a dogmatic to an evidence-based worldview is very far from being complete. So I'd like to thank you all for your patience in sitting through this long diatribe, and to open the floor to all the comments and criticisms you'd care to throw at me.
I just thought before we go out for your questions, I'll just tell you about the next two sessions, because that might help you when you put your questions to Alan, just in case there's anything you want to ask that actually would be better suited for the next lectures. Okay, so the next lecture we're doing in April is How We Learned to Question Medicine, and that will be given by Professor Paul Garner, who's Professor Emeritus in Evidence Synthesis in Global Health at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. And he's going to build on the themes of this lecture. So he will watch the video of this lecture, and he will be looking at how an insistence on robust evidence and research has led not only to scientific breakthroughs, but also to the exposure of malpractice. So that's what we asked Paul to explore. And then the final session, which is at the end of May, is titled Science Under Pressure, Restoring Public Confidence. And that's going to have Tracy Brown, the director of Sense About Science, who's here tonight, in conversation with Toby Young, who is partly will be wearing his Free Speech Union hat, but I think he's also going to be wearing his hat as editor of the Daily Skeptic, which in some ways was what made me want to do this series, which on skepticism. So they're going to reflect on the themes of the earlier two sessions. So I just thought I'd set that out first, so you know that medicine's coming next, so you don't bombard Alan with medicine questions. Okay, so in the room, could we have an indication of who wants to ask Alan a question? And if you can just ask straightforward questions to start with, that would be very helpful.
I know this might be slightly outside the realm of your talk, but you've described the titans of the American scientific and medical establishment all agreeing that sex is assigned at birth. Now, they know that is not so. What force has led them to so compromise their views?
Well, as I said, I'm always reluctant to speculate about other people's states of mind, right? I criticize the accuracy of what people write and try not to speculate whether it's due to incompetence, due to dishonesty, or perhaps a combination of both. But in this case, I think it's pretty obvious that the cause is political. They want to be on what they see as the right side of history on a particular social issue, and they're cutting corners to get there. I mean, and that's what I think is dangerously wrong. That if the cause is just, you can defend it in full acceptance of facts about the real world. You should not twist those facts.
Thank you.
Of course, I'm a physicist. I'm not a biologist. But the biology I gave you was pretty standard biology, and I have checked it with real biologists.
Thank you. Okay, hands up. Yes, over here. So these are questions, hopefully.
Thanks for the talk. I would like to ask about some angles which come to my mind, me being a scientist as well, and part from observation, personal observation, some angles that I didn't see explored as well. One of them being that even taking out the current cultural, ideological pressure put on, one of the things that affects greatly science in research is people's own personal bias or animosities between individuals. Sometimes affects the way studies are assessed, evaluated, or allowed for publication. So that is one of the factors, just people being people and letting their own feelings get in the way. So more criteria for objectivity. Other angle is there's a lot of research that sometimes is actively suppressed or kept in the quiet because it does not benefit some entity. For example, certain types of research that could compromise pharmaceuticals' business model. There are also studies that could have huge social impact, which is of a very unknown, very random nature, which are not done because of that, because they're effectively a Pandora's box. The example of IQ and race comes to mind. So all of these things, there are pressures against doing these studies for one reason or another. And another thing that I see, and I didn't see explored, is when you do a research, any type of research starts with a premise, and then you conduct a research to verify if your premise is true or false, or if there is a correlation between your event A and your theory that B is the cause, or something like that. And when it is not verified, basically you verify that there is not. I would say to people as a scientist, okay, we just found another way not to do something, or how something doesn't happen. But I think in some circles and in some spheres, when your research leads to nothing or to an inconclusive cause or a non-correlation, it's seen as failure. That sort of mentality, I see it, and that's the thing that I would like to see more explored more, talked about, and addressed, and maybe changed over time. So, yeah, those are the angles that come.
Let me just say, all of those points are correct and important. So the first one about rivalries between different scientists and how that compromises objectivity, that's a very important point, and that's why, if there is free and open debate, the scientific community as a whole is more objective than any of its members. And that's what's important. You need free and open debate, and you also need viewpoint diversity. That is to say, you need people coming from different angles on the particular issues at question. And in that way, the scientific community can be more objective than any individual scientist can be. But all of your other points are absolutely correct and important, too.
Thank you. Okay, yes, down here.
What did you make of the hoax study 2.0 by Peter Boghossian and co.?
Oh, does everybody know what he's referring to? No. Okay. So you know, I mean, this is a little bit of a digression, so we probably shouldn't go on too long. Maybe after some wine we can. But okay. So, as Jan said, you know what I became famous for. You know what my obituary is going to say. No matter how many theorems I prove. Anyway, okay. So in 1996, I wrote a parody article which was accepted for publication as a regular article. Okay, so Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose a few years ago decided to do the experiment a little more systematically and wrote 20-odd articles in the course of a few months. I mean, it's kind of amazing that they did this. They wrote 20-odd articles, submitted them to a variety of journals in the social sciences, but those corners of the social sciences that are very ideological. They called it grievance studies, so women's studies, gender studies, queer studies, fat studies, and by the way, and some straight sociology journals. And it's an interesting, all of their parody articles were rejected by the standard sociology journals. But quite a few of them were accepted for publication in these other journals. I think 4 were published, and several more were accepted for publication when the hoax fell apart because a Wall Street Journal reporter started digging and uncovered, and they had to confess. So what does it prove? Well, again, you know, these things don't prove a lot in and of themselves. I mean, after my hoax article was published, I had to stress that the fact that it was published doesn't prove very much by itself. It proves that one particular journal was sloppy in refereeing the article. What really proves something is the detailed critique that you make afterwards, which is what Jean Bricmont and I did in our book, Intellectual Impostures, and what Peter and Helen and James did in some of their subsequent writings. But you shouldn't try to infer too much from the fact that those were published, although, you know, their experiment was certainly more systematic than mine was.
Thank you. Okay, more hands. I know that Mike will talk for a bit longer than at the moment I'm planning for. So if you've got a quick question, Mike, I'll come to you. But otherwise, I'm going to hold you off because I know you too well. Okay, there's a chap here. And then, yes, we'll come to you. Don't worry. Yeah, that's fine because you're closer.
Thanks. One problem is that we seem to have lost trust in sources of knowledge in society. And I mean, it's kind of undermining epistemology, if I can be pompous about it in some ways. Social media is not helping. The deconstruction of the old power structures has assisted in that. How do we reconstruct it so we've got something we can rely on again in life?
I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm a physicist, a mathematician, possibly an amateur philosopher. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychologist. I tried to read as much as I can about those fields, but you know, those are really, really difficult questions. I mean, I've tried to set forth what I think is a sensible idea of what science does and does not do, and how it should do it, and how it should not do it. How you get the society as a whole to understand that and to have an attitude which is neither gullible and just believing everything that somebody who calls themselves a scientist says, or even what the scientific associations say, nor cynical and rejecting everything. How you get people to be thoughtfully critical, I don't know. I mean, it involves education in the schools and the universities. It involves the mass media. I don't know.
there was a study in the paper this week, and I didn't go and follow up the study to see if it had any credibility at all, but the headline was that pseudoscience is most appealing to those who are scientifically inclined. And so the more that people are kind of familiar with a scientific vocabulary, the more persuaded they are by BS ideas that are dressed up in the scientific vocabulary. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in. Yes, the chap over here.
You've been thinking about this for a while now. Do you think things are getting better or worse?
I don't know. I mean, you know, there was an article a few years ago, I guess it must have been the 25th anniversary of the publication of my parody article, and the title was "Sokal Won the Battle and Lost the War." And I fear that the author was right. So what happened, so initially, I won the battle. Well, not just me, right? I mean, there were people who were saying things like this before me. Noam Chomsky, Barbara Ehrenreich, many people were saying these things before me, but they weren't heard. But so temporarily, I won the battle in the sense that a lot of people retreated from some of their extreme positions. In fact, the sociologists tended to say, I am not and never have been an epistemic relativist. So there was this retreat, but now this extreme social constructivism has come back in a way, as I explained briefly in my talk, in a way that's more bizarre, right? I mean, saying that quarks are constructed is wrong, but at least it's subtle. Saying that sex is socially constructed is, I mean, you know, you don't have to be a scientist to realize that that's wrong. So somehow, political and social ideas have become so powerful in influencing what people think that they somehow override obvious facts about the world. I find it bizarre. And of course, people come up with semi-plausible justifications. I mean, the justifications don't hold water, but they're somehow intended to, at least to convince themselves. And so, you know, there's a complicated interaction between self-deception and deception of others.
Yes, there's a lady with a hand up there.
Hello. Could you talk a little bit about the idea of harm? Because I'm under the impression that academic publishing, that in order to get published, you have to pass some sort of test to prove that your study will not cause harm to any particular group, and that's a new sort of hurdle that you have to, I'd say new to me, a hurdle that you have to get past. Is that the case, or is that just sort of field-specific or journal-specific?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's something I only became aware of a few days ago, actually. That apparently, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, Nature, which is, of course, one of the most prestigious scientific journals, published an editorial which arrogated to the editors the right to refuse publication or even retract post-publication any article that, so I don't remember the exact words, but would cause harm or reasonably could be believed to cause harm to any socially defined group. So this is an incredibly vague criterion, which moreover has nothing to do with the scientific validity of the study. Now, the link between a scientific study which is purporting to tell facts about the real world and harm, it's a very indirect link. I mean, there are some cases where it's clear, right? If you publish details of how to construct a nuclear weapon, right? Or you publish the detailed genome for, I don't know, I mean, I guess the genome for COVID is publicly known, but you can imagine that there are some things that could allow people to create dangerous weapons that shouldn't be published, right? So there's a very narrow category of facts which ought to be suppressed because they cause harm, they could cause harm in a very clear and precise sense. But in what sense would suppose that, for example, there would to be a study showing that, let me take something plausible, right? We know in my department of mathematics, I don't know, I think maybe about 25% of the academic staff are women, okay? We have no idea to what extent that stems from past discrimination, from stereotyping, you know, that girls at age 13 get told that mathematics is not your thing, and so on and so on. We have no idea in a non-sexist society what fraction of mathematicians would be men and what fraction would be women. But it's possible that it wouldn't be 50-50. There is some evidence, again, I'm not a psychologist, but there is some evidence that in things like spatial relations, men's brains are on average better than women's brains. It's also some evidence that on language, women's brains are better. So maybe in a non-sexist society, 60% of mathematicians would be men and 60% of lawyers would be women. I have no idea how things would turn out in a future non-sexist society. But suppose somebody comes up with convincing evidence about the differences, which are merely statistical differences after all, between men's brains and women's brains. What harm would that do to anyone? Some people might say it causes harm, but that doesn't imply, I mean, just because, even if it's true that on average men are better mathematicians than women, that doesn't mean that you should discriminate against any particular woman. You judge that woman by her production, period. And so, but that's the kind of study that I could imagine would get censored under this kind of rule. And I can imagine that Sally Baxendall's studies on puberty blockers would get censored on the alleged grounds that it does harm to transgender people. Of course, she would argue that those studies protect teenagers who are questioning their gender identity from possibly dangerous medicines. But you can imagine how vague criteria like this open the door to ideological censorship of science. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a very serious danger.
Thank you. Vinay, should we just take a few from the Q&A and then we'll come back out? I can see the hands. Yeah.
So we've got a question about climate change and kind of skepticism on that front. Do you believe that it is regrettable that scientists whose views on the causes and future trajectory of climate change differ from the prevailing orthodoxy of those who are often labeled as climate deniers, particularly as it seems that properly organized public debate between the scientists who disagree with each other does not take place?
First, I should say I'm not an expert in climate science, and I haven't followed those, those scientific debates in detail. So I'm, like the rest of you, I'm just an ordinary citizen on that. So all I would say is there should be an open debate where minority views, if they are well-reasoned, are heard. And I don't have enough knowledge of how that debate has proceeded to say whether those minority views have been heard fairly or not. I mean, if they've been heard fairly and are rejected by the majority because the majority has reasoned criticisms of them, then that is how science should operate. That's all I can say.
One of the questions that I had when I was trying to formulate this series, Alan, was how do we understand what a reasonable question is? Because at the moment, I think there's a sort of tendency amongst people to say, well, what do we know anyway? We don't know anything, so everything becomes a reasonable question. But obviously that's not how science proceeds, is it?
Right. I mean, in all of the mature sciences, there is a well-established corpus of knowledge, which of course can change, right? I mean, it used to be believed that Newtonian mechanics was exactly correct. Since 1905, we've known that Newtonian mechanics is not exactly correct. It's approximately correct to a very high degree of accuracy in a very large range of phenomena, but it's not exactly correct, and it has to be replaced by special and general relativity and by quantum mechanics. And so a similar thing is likely to happen to a good chunk of our scientific knowledge. Some of it is just plain wrong and will have to be, totally revised. For example, when geologists' rejection of continental drift, we now know that continental drift does occur. On the other hand, large parts of accepted scientific knowledge probably are correct, even if not exactly correct, and we build on that.
Thank you. Okay, is another question from there?
Yeah, I think this one's quite important. It's from an anonymous attendee. It says, I work in a biology department of university, and there are gender identity flags all over the department. How do we push back?
Gender identity
Flags.
flags.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question that I would be interested in knowing, are these people within the department or are they outsiders? And then, the problem is, of course, people have social and political loyalties that sometimes override their reason. And that can happen to scientists too. It's very unfortunate. Because, as I say, one can perfectly well defend transgender people from discrimination and harassment, and nevertheless say sex is a biological fact. I mean, there's no contradiction between the two. I don't see why anybody should think that there is a contradiction. But some people do, and I don't know what to do about it. I mean, the problem, of course, is to the extent that those tribal loyalties overriding evidence are happening within the scientific community, you've got a big problem, right? You're fighting your own colleagues if you want to stand up for evidence, and if you have a precarious contract, you're risking your job. I mean, Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker are too big to be canceled, right? But cancellation attempts against them were not by accident. Cancellation attempts at them are intended to intimidate the less powerful people from saying the same things. And some of the less powerful people have been victimized. So, for example, at Harvard, Carol Hooven, a developmental biologist, who author of an acclaimed book on testosterone, acclaimed teacher, or at least according to the student newspaper, she had the temerity to say on national television that there were two sexes defined by gametes, and she immediately went on to say that despite that, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't respect people's identities, right? I mean, you don't have to deny biology to respect people's identities. She was hounded out of her department by people within her department. She wasn't fired, but things were made so uncomfortable for her that she ended up quitting. Same thing happened to Colin Wright, a postdoctoral biologist at Penn State, who dared to speak publicly about these things. So it's a real problem. I mean, in physics and mathematics, we don't have to deal with that yet. But maybe it'll come.
Are you not being decolonized?
There's some pressure to decolonize our curriculum, but nobody takes it seriously. My decolonization is when I teach Noether's theorem, I point out that Emmy Noether, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, was denied a professorship at Göttingen because, why? Because she had 2 X chromosomes.
Thank you. Okay, Vinay, let's just come to Trace, then we'll come to the back row, don't worry.
Thanks. Fantastic talk. Alan, can I challenge you? Because you've talked about the social and political strength of argument that has kind of come into science and distorted it. That threw me back to around 10 years ago. We were approached often at Sense About Science by people looking for the scientific argument for abortion. And when I looked into it, they wanted the argument because they were being confronted by the scientific argument against abortion. And what really struck me at the time was it wasn't so much the strength of those social and political views, it was the weakness that was driving them to look to science for the answer. And I wonder, in some of the examples you're using now, it shows a lack of confidence in our social and political solutions and answers to people's problems, that they're looking to science to try and sort of, pull it in as the pray in aid of their claim. And perhaps it's the weakness, not the strength, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, all I would say is, with an issue like abortion, the scientists should tell you what the facts are about, how the human body works, and that does not determine what one should do about it, right? I mean, we have to discuss values as well as facts, and we should try to keep as clear a separation as possible between facts and values. We should not be worrying, as in that previous question, we should not be worrying that establishing the facts will cause harm. Whatever your values may be, you need to know the facts. And we all need to know the facts, at least if this is going to be a democracy. We all need to know the facts, and we all, those of us who have the facts need to share them honestly. And then we all may have different values, and we have to debate those values. But at least we should try to keep the facts separate from the values.
Thanks, Alan. So there's a series of hands up along the back. So if you start over here.
Okay. Actually, slightly following on from Tracy's question at the front, just an observation. In the probably early 90s, in the gay rights movement, there was a period of time when the idea that the gay gene might exist, and that was in a way a scientific argument to try and make a case for a social right. It didn't last very long as an argument, but it was some parallels to today, although I think what's happening with the biological sex is much more about people trying to force a division in society and essentially to propose something so preposterous that by adopting it as an idea that you accept, you're showing that you're on the side of their side of irrationality, that you're prepared to take an idea on that's so ridiculous. So I don't think it's really about trans rights at all. But more specifically, I'd be interested to know who is standing up for rationality and skepticism in science, and particularly outside the Anglosphere. You've mentioned, obviously, Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins today. But, are we on our own in this room in the Art Workers Guild, or are there people in elsewhere in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America or whatever, who are also standing and fighting the good fight? And then finally, I just wanted to ask, we talked about motivations, and I understand that you don't want to look inside people's heads, but I wonder what your thoughts about the role of funding in motivation are. So we've had two huge issues in the recent years, climate change, and people may have seen Climate, the movie, recently, Martin Durkin's film, and obviously the pandemic, both of which seem to be areas in which skepticism and debate and questioning about science, and they call it the science, obviously in order to shut down debate, have been stymied. And they seem to be stymied partly because the funding, and this is a point Climate, the movie, makes probably most strongly, disincentivizes people from publishing work or advocating for their belief that contradicts, the consensus in science. And, the role of Francis Collins and Dr. Anthony Fauci, NIH and in the US, in essentially controlling funding for large numbers of scientists in the US and abroad, seems to have actually distorted the debate about the pandemic. Likewise, in the UK, UKRI, and our friends at the Wellcome Trust, half a mile away, seem to have very distinct views about what is and isn't acceptable in science. And the more funding there is for science that comes from government and major institutions, is it the case that they have more control over what is scientifically allowed to be said? Or am I being paranoid, and was this always the case?
I'm going to have to disclaim, basically not be able to answer either of those questions on the grounds of lack of expertise. So on the first question, who's standing up for science, I just, don't have enough knowledge of that all around the world. Most scientists were just, doing our jobs and doing our research and our teaching and not worrying too much about the general health of the scientific community. Of course, that's easy to do if you're sitting in a math department. It's not so easy to do in a biology department. 20 years ago in the United States, it wasn't so easy in a biology department because you had the creationists on your back in state legislatures. Now, it's not so easy in biology departments for different reasons. Who is speaking out about this, I don't claim to know. As far as the second question, I know even less. All I would say is sociologists of science should investigate things like that, right? They should investigate issues of funding and how that affects what research gets done, what research doesn't get done, what research gets done but not published, and so on. There are lots and lots of important things that sociologists of science can and should be doing.
Thank you. Right. Now there's another hand gone up. Okay, so the chap. Okay, so let's just go along that row there. But could you be relatively quick? Is that possible?
One thing I've noticed recently is this tendency to take, say, something that's observed, say, in a small social situation, maybe over a small time, and expand that to apply to everybody everywhere, which is really a basic fallacy in how you actually use the evidence to create either grand theories or a case study, and they seem to be all mixed up, and then people get, take the race, what happened in America, and apply it everywhere. But of course, it's not the same. Can you talk about that?
Okay, thank you. As that wasn't such a direct question, I will go on to the person to Mike next. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, hi. A pleasure, Professor, as a UCL alumnus, history a long time ago, to hear someone actually from that institution actually standing up for rationality and empiricism. Very briefly, isn't one of the ironies of this whole situation, and perhaps one of the impediments to resolving it, that the proponents of this irrationalism that you're fighting use a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-rationalist language. The obvious example is this proliferation of phobias that we have to deal with. When people talk about gender assigned at birth, and then say, "Well, of course, I respect the feelings of people who genuinely suffer from gender dysphoria," they often say, "I am not transphobic," and sooner or later, you've got to start saying, "Well, I'm not transphobic because the term transphobic is gibberish. It's contradictory. A phobia is not an antipathy, an antagonism. It's a fear, and this use of language simply it confuses the issue, and it's got to be rejected. Full stop."
Thank you. Somebody I was speaking to the other day said, "Yeah, everybody's got a spectrum now, haven't they?" Yes. The chap there.
Yeah, would you like to be surprised by some sound scientific reasons for adopting homeopathy on the NHS? Would you like to be surprised?
Would I like to be surprised?
Yes.
I mean, if somebody proposed sound scientific reasons, I would.
I'd like
yeah.
to.
I mean,
I'd like to test your thoughts on this.
As I say, I'm open to hearing convincing evidence that my current opinions are wrong. But in the case of homeopathy, the evidence had better be pretty strong.
It is.
You can talk to Alan immediately afterwards, but I just think
maybe over a glass of wine.
Okay.
Not homeopathic wine.
No, not homeopathic wine.
We will not dilute the wine by a factor of 10 to the 20th.
You say that. There might have been a budget.
Just very briefly, I would just say that Archie Cochrane recommended the judicious use of placebo in the NHS in his 1971 seminal book, which laid the foundations for evidence-based medicine. If you go onto YouTube, you can see a video of Ben Goldacre explaining about the placebo effect, and he raves about how strong the placebo effect is. Also Simon Singh helped me out with this one as well, because he basically said that when people go to the doctor, a lot of them just get well anyway. So if you had homeopathy as a first line in the NHS, it works even if the patient knows it's a placebo, so you don't have to deceive anyone.
All I want to say is, I mean, the point is that one can admit that homeopathic remedies are placebos and nevertheless advocate their use. And I agree, it raises serious ethical questions, but they're not scientific questions. They're ethical questions which need to be debated.
Thank you. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for a really great and important talk, Ellen. I really enjoyed that. I'm sure everyone else did. I want to come back again about what we can do when things go wrong in academia, like the question that we had online. Because we know there have been quite a few cases where, freedom of speech was messed with, where people were pressurized, where people were getting into trouble just for speaking out on what the truth is they found through science. And this is all co-organized by unions, so I want to come to the role of the unions. Because, I know that's a bit of a funny topic, because obviously if people are targeted in an academic setting, the academic unions should stand up for them. And I'm aware of cases where the Free Speech Union has done a great job helping people, but it's not the only union that operates in academia, and we are aware of other unions in academia who not only don't defend enough people who are actually targeted, they actually also extremely play the political game, and actually kind of almost help targeting people they should actually defend. And if you're comfortable saying something about that, I'm sure we would love to hear about it. Thank you.
Well, yes, I'm a member of the University and College Union, as many of us are, and I'm sad to say that at least on some, okay, I won't. So I recently wrote an article about this in The Critic, so I won't repeat it. But the upshot is that the Tory government has done a good job of defending the freedom of speech of Zionists and gender-critical feminists, and has attacked the freedom of speech of pro-Palestinians, and the University and College Union has done the opposite. And those of us who actually want to defend everyone's freedom of speech, and above all, it's not just the freedom to speak. The important thing is the freedom of debate. It's freedom to hear, right? It's not, if you suppress somebody, it's not so much that you're suppressing them. You're preventing other people from hearing what they have to say. And that's what's important. I think we should all reread John Stuart Mill. And we should all take it seriously and defend, above all, the freedom of speech of the people that we disagree with. Because of course we're going to defend the freedom of speech of the people we agree with. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to do that. But we have to think seriously about defending the freedom of speech of the people we disagree with, for both of the reasons that John Stuart Mill said. Because they might be right, or they might, as he pointed out, they might be partially right. It might be that I'm 99% right, but there's still a little bit that I can improve by hearing critiques of my position. That's one thing. And the other side is, even if I'm 100% right, I will only properly understand that if I can hear what the critiques are, and then understand why they're wrong.
That was like a plant question, the perfect question for the end of the evening. So can we just all have a big round of applause for Alan and say thank you very much. So, as I said earlier, we have 2 further events in this series. On Wednesday, the 24th of April, we'll be back here and we'll hear from Professor Paul Garner. And then on May the 29th, we'll be back here again in person with Tracy Brown and Toby Young discussing, and it will be very much a kind of a follow-through from the preceding lectures. So do book your tickets now, because I'm pretty sure we'll sell out after this one. So book early, don't leave it. And if you're joining online, and thank you very much to all of those people that have joined us online tonight, you can go to our website to find out more information about those events. So freespeechunion.org, go to the events page. And to join online, you can either, if you're not a member, you can buy a ticket to join online or in person via that events page. But if you are a Free Speech Union member or a supporter of Sense About Science, you'll be emailed the link to join free of charge. So there's an incentive to support both of these organisations. And if you're not a member of the Free Speech Union already, do go and have a look at our website, freespeechunion.org, and go to the join page, and you'll find all the information about what we do there. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for joining us online, and we will see you hopefully at the next 2 events.